Hey guys, I'm gonna do my second part of this. It's kind of late. It's 11:30, but maybe some of the European guys will be up at least. I finished a session just a little bit ago, and my brain was, I think, working better than usual, just in terms of thinking poker. So I figured it would be a good time to sit down and answer some of the questions that you guys left in the blog this week, because they were a little bit more technical oriented. So there's three things I also want to say in this that are more along the lines of how poker relates to getting better at life. Just examples on the day-to-day that, like, when I'm out in public, I realize, like, oh, most people aren't seeing this concept, which I learned through poker, but also applies to just learning processes in general, accuracy in general. So one of those things occurred for me at the gym. Hold on, I just want to make sure that my Instagram is running. So one of those things occurred for me at the gym where I came to this realization that most people are not getting results at the gym because they don't understand what creates maximum progress or maximum growth. When I look around at the gym, and I'm no expert, but I can tell when someone's performing a lift wrong. Like, it's really obvious when you look at someone at the gym and they don't know what the fuck they're doing. I don't need to be an expert to know that someone's doing a lift in an imbalanced way, because it almost looks like they're going to hurt themselves 9 times out of 10. So I look at something like that, and I also look at the intensity that they're performing the exercise with. And the thing that seems most stand out to me is that people are not driving the repetitions to pure failure. So what is pure failure? It is the point at which your body literally fails while you're executing the exercise with good form. Most people sit down to do a set at the gym with the narrative in their mind that they don't want to go to failure because it's the most painful thing. So if you have that in the root of your mind when you sit down to do a set, you're constantly going to be in an aversion state to the final 2 reps. Your mind will start the rep count, and by the time you get to 3 or 4, you're already terrified of getting to 6 or 7 because you know you're going to fail. When actually this is really counterproductive, because you're actually there to fail. If you want maximum growth, maximum efficiency, your goal should be stop counting reps. Almost, if rep counting is stopping you from getting to pure failure because it sets you up in your mind to be afraid of getting to the final rep, then my advice would be to stop counting reps altogether and put your focus strictly on getting to pure failure in as pure a way as possible. Meaning you take your attention completely off of anything but performing the exercise in a way that's proper and moving it to completion. And I mean until your body fails. Some of these guys at the gym, the guys that like get banned for screaming, they're actually going to pure failure. I think they have other imbalances, because I don't think all the grunting and hollering is necessarily necessary. But there is a way to go to pure failure with intensity, with poise, and to get the max out of that set. And so that's what I've been focusing on lately, is like, from looking around and just doing a lot of observing, it's just like, why the hell am I not going about this in a more intense, deliberate way? I'm here. I might as well get the most out of my lift. If I can see that I'm only afraid of failing, then I can change the narrative that I'm here to fail. And because I'm here to fail and I embrace that, I can actually progress faster than anybody else. That's something I learned through poker, but it's also something that's sort of one of those universal truths that I can apply to other activities. So I'm no exercise wizard by any means, but my abs are coming in pretty nice. And I think one of the reasons is that I'm really performing at the gym at this level of intensity and solid form that I think most people don't understand quietly, which is why they don't do it. Another life example that I saw this week that's related. I've been shopping at Whole Foods lately because I've been keeping it real clean, cooking a lot, and I found myself people watching at Whole Foods. And the funny thing about being in that type of place, for the European guys, I don't know if you know what that is, but it's like the premier nutrition grocery store in the States. Super expensive, but high quality stuff, like for sure. So I'm always fascinated at Whole Foods by how excited people are and how like into it they are, that they're there and they're going to find the nutrition hack that day that's going to give them the magic pill to their success. Because it's hyped up. Like there's a stigma, eat healthy, eat organic, and it's going to work out for you. The problem is these people are really outside of their capacity, most of them, in how they're able to implement nutrition practically into their life. So what does that mean? It means the guy who's buying the vegan protein powder, extra distilled, 10 minutes later is buying cookies over in the aisle, the dessert aisle. So I'm seeing something like this and I'm like, okay, why is this guy failing? It's because he's trying to implement a really, really premier nutrition strategy that's outside of his ability or capacity to follow because he doesn't have any discipline. So it's very much like what the GTO complex is in poker, where you saw guys get hypnotized, mesmerized by the promise of GTO. And then when application came along and they were forced to sort of find a way to practically implement, everyone failed because it's too hard. It was outside of their capacity. It's outside of their discipline to integrate that level of complexity. Whole Foods is no different because most people operate from really, really low level of self-discipline. They're not going to the gym to complement their nutrition, or they're going and they're performing wrong, or they're buying the cookies on top of it, or they're just eating too much, not monitoring their macros. So it's all these things that, like, when I see it, I'm like, God, most people are deluding themselves in how effective seemingly good life strategies are. And it's almost painful to watch. It's like this combination of comedy, but like painful comedy, because it's a shame to think for people to think that they're helping themselves, but for them to really be sort of spinning wheels. I did a podcast with Elliot Rowe today. It'll be out in a week. I'll post the link up in the blog and maybe even here on Facebook. But one of the things that came up, he asked this question at the end of the interview. He said, we always do this, but one of the things that we ask guys is, what's the biggest instance of tilt that you've ever witnessed? And I said, okay, I'll relate it to my own experience because I think that would just be most relevant. I sat there for like 10 seconds and I couldn't really think of like one specific thing where I went on like massive tilt. Not in poker, at least. I was never someone who like blew my roll, sitting high stakes or anything like that. And then it hit me. I was like, you know what? My entire 20s, for the most part, I was on a life tilt, subtle life tilt. Maybe not so subtle to someone who is able to see what's going on, but I wasn't able to see it. I wasn't able to see how insistent my learning methods were, and that I wasn't getting the results from the amount of effort that I was putting in. Not even close. And I should have taken trajectory shifts earlier. And I should have listened to feedback from my environment, but I didn't. So in a way, I think that's the most painful form of tilt, the tilt that you can't really see, that goes on for years. Most guys are worried about making a mistake at the table, but like, what if you punted a decade of your life off? And I think you guys, if you can visualize that, you'll understand the intensity that I speak from in terms of the ambition to sort of get this message across to the community that if you're still sitting there without results after years of playing this game, it's probably like in the 99th percentile of probability that you are learning inefficiently, or you are attempting an inefficient learning model, and that you're in the same shoes that I was during my 20s, until I decided to get a little bit more humble and take the cue from life. For Patrick in the chat, who's a stockbroker boy, good friend of the family, GTO is game theory optimal. Basically means perfect play. That's what everybody sort of shoots for, but nobody can achieve. And in a lot of ways, it makes people do really stupid shit because they do it under under the premise that they're performing perfectly, but since they don't actually know how to implement that, they end up really far from the mark. So it's sort of the joke of poker, but the really sad joke, like since 2015, is that there's so many guys wasting time striving for perfection, where a more practical approach is not only more relevant but more accurate because of how the markets are imbalanced. So I'm sort of relating it to your language in the sense that, like, if you think about an imbalanced market, a perfect strategy should not be perfectly balanced. A perfectly strategy should be exploiting the market. And in a lot of ways, you can practicalize your strategy in poker, simplify it, and gain accuracy. So yeah, I think this probably applies a lot to what you do with your patterns of investment. I'm gonna save the third thing that I was thinking about for the end, but it's single-handedly, it might be the most valuable free piece of information I've ever given. If you understand this thing that I'll say at the end of the pod, if I forget, just remind me. If you understand it, it's the difference between moving up to high stakes at a very, very high rate because you understand this important thing about psychology, and staying stuck at low stakes. It's pertaining to how to determine what is the major differences between a bad reg, a good reg, and a great reg. And if you get this, it's going to completely remap how you format your strategy. And I think it's a type of thing that I can give away and feel okay about because it's true and it works, but you can't hack it. Like, you have to actually commit to it. And there's a level of self-discipline and humility and consistency necessary to actually integrate it and apply it over and over and over again. So just remind me at the end. I'm going to start with these questions in the blog, but I'll get to that. Dirk Diggler asked in the blog, how do we gain vision over the imbalance of a player pool and there's no hand tracking software and we can't get hand histories to do data analysis on the pool? For one, that's not entirely true. It's never going to be entirely true if you're doing your homework. In the night vision pack that we put out on Detox, we were able to get our hands on 100 million hands, all from various sites that had varying pools. And one of the things that made that pack so valuable, in my opinion, was that we found very, very correlating trends across all pools. So almost the reason why we were able to put that pack out publicly and have it be worth something is because there was such correlation. And it made my life a lot easier when making the video, because now I could just say, hey guys, here are the 10 biggest zones where every single pool that we've researched is leaking. And we were using soft pools too. Like, this was around the time where we had a fairly large Bovada sample, Bovada being the most, the softest site that we had seen in quite some time, almost mimicking like what a live poker table would look like. Like, if you sat down at Live 510 in Vegas, that was very much like what 510 Full Ring was on Bovada Ignition for a while, back in 2015, 2016. I don't know really what it's like now. So we were drawing parallels from that. Like, I'm observant enough to realize that if live poker seems to be playing a lot like Bovada, with the amount of player profiles matching up, like there's 7 nitfish, a maniac, and a good reg. If I know that I'm sitting at a table where the profiles match a pool that I've studied online with mass data analysis, then I can sort of make broad stroke assumptions about the fact that they're probably operating in similar fashions with regard to frequencies and pool imbalances. But for the most part, I would say what we were fascinated by, and the reason that we decided to go forward with putting that pack out publicly, is that the hotspots were so consistently correlative between all the pools that we looked at. So it was very easy to synthesize a pack and just be like, here's the 10 or 15 things that if you start operating almost on autopilot, you'll see immediate win rate gain. So to answer your question simply, it's not exactly true that you'll never have vision. You just have to sort of make a little bit of assumption in the direction of the pools that I have access to, which one is my pool closest to? And then to go even simpler than that, I almost guarantee that all of the hotspots that we researched in night vision are going to apply to the pool that you're in. From there, it becomes more about player profiling, because if you have better reads on player profiling, like I said, if you know that you're sitting down at a table with 7 of this player type, 1 maniac, and 1 of this player type, it's much easier to sort of process that in your calibrative system in your head and be like, okay, so this is very similar to this pool that I've studied, or it's going to trend this way because guys are playing a little bit fishier, so maybe I'll tone back the aggression just a little bit. Stuff like that. This question's about adjustments in the blueprint strategies that I recommend just through a lot of my training. Specifically, this guy's mentioning 1/3 c-bet option in position, checking range, out of position. So those are 2 different things that I sort of advocate. Basically, when I built the PO Unlocked pack, the first public course I put out, the purpose of it was to practicalize the community's problem with GTO by creating simplified, well-balanced strategies. And a part of that was using this 1/3 c-bet option in position, because it allowed me to use 1 strategy option while retaining an acceptable amount of EV, because it is a deviation from optimal. But it was an acceptable deviation, in my opinion, when we ran how hard a solver could exploit it, how difficult the strategy was that he would have to play to exploit it. Both of those things made it seem more appealing, and for what it's worth, the pool does not respond well. The universal player pool does not respond well at all to facing a 1/3 c-bet. They're overfolding, they're not check raising enough. A lot of guys' aversion to the 1/3 was what happens when people start adjusting. I was mentioning this on the Elliott podcast today, that like the major assumption in the community when exploitative strategies are introduced as an option is that they basically default towards saying, well, this can't be true, because if it were true, everybody would already be doing it. And since they're not, that must mean that it's already been tried, so there's no way this can be true. When really what we've found is that because these exploitative strategies win at such a high clip, what actually happens is a player's moving up so quickly through the ranks. Like, say somebody starts at 50 NL. They play 100,000 hands at 50 NL, and they already made 50 buy-ins or so, they can jump to 100 NL. Now, there's new regs there who aren't hip to this exploitative blueprint strategy. So if you're persistent and consistent in your strategy, then you're going to move up really quick, and the exploitative blueprint strategies are going to basically print money because you're up against a pool who doesn't quite know exactly what you're doing. They just don't have enough stats on you, or they're too lazy to adjust. So let's take it further and say, okay, well, what happens if we get to like 500 Zoom? What's up, man? I see you. One of my former students now plays 500 Zoom, and I heard you're doing really well from Zenfish, so congrats. What happens when you get there? And maybe I'm wrong, maybe they're not playing like that good there, I don't know. But I'm guessing that they are able to respond a little bit better to to 1/3 strategies by implementing check raises. My advice there would be, don't give it so much credit that just because someone starts check raising at a higher rate that they're going to be consistently or able to exploit you over the long term. Let's just put it that way. The way I see it, and it's very funny for me at this stage, to see from the other end how many guys are c-betting 1/3 themselves, even when I'm playing. Like, I just played a session where playing a lot of heads up lately, and the guy I'm playing is implementing the 1/3 strategy. And it's funny to be playing guys who are implementing strategies that I, as a public coach and methodologist, was on the frontier of creating that trend. Like, I basically created the 1/3 wave. It's probably either the major figure of 1 or 2 guys that was on that tip before it became sort of popular. So now I'm sitting down versus a guy who's doing the 1/3 thing versus me. And it's just like a funny moment where it's like, wow, this is so full circle. Like, this guy's trying to beat me with my own creation. So it's humbling, and it's fun to go up against guys who think they know what they're doing. But then you see very quickly with most of these guys, their fluency with these strategies is very ill-equipped. So what I see when I'm c-betting 1/3 is if somebody wants to try to start check raising me a ton, exploitatively, the first thing that they're going to realize is that they need to start to organize the check raising range in a more advanced way. Like, they're not going to get away with just check raising me with an abundance of air. They have to start taking a more advanced exploit. The first one being depolarizing the value range. That's how a solver begins to minimally exploit. In other words, there's no recounter. This is how it retains EV. That's how a solver begins to minimally exploit a 1/3 strategy. It begins to depolarize the value range, balance enough bluffs. The immature strategy is just be like, this guy's c-betting 1/3 too much. I'm just going to check raise too much air and hope he folds. But I can counter that very easily. I just start calling anything with showdown value. And I have more than enough of it, and I can even float you and wait to see what you do on the turn if you check and pile on you. So the fact that there's 2 streets left to act and I have position, like, to me, that's a moment in my head where it's like, I know I'm going to win the hand way too often if this guy's not very well versed on how to protect his range out of position. And that's what most guys are sort of overestimating their ability to retain EV out of position after an initially accurate flop exploit. So basically what this means is you have guys who will say, well, Nick Howard's recommending c-betting 1/3. This strategy can't be good. Let's figure out how to exploit it. So they go on the solver and they say, look, I can prove that the solver wants to check raise 25 or 30% and then it takes EV away. Guys, this is what we need to do. But you lack vision, because if you believe that you can accurately implement the turn and river decision tree, there's 2 more streets left to play, bro, and I have position on you. So if you think that you're going to exploit a excellent player out of position with 2 streets left to act, unless you're very well versed in how to operate your range, that's what arrogance is, I think. And most of the guys that are using solvers are using them lacking vision of how multi-street situations are affecting the EV that they're able to retain versus very good players. I don't see this a lot. I remember somebody saying OTB Red Baron was doing a lot of this. I'm not sure if that's true, but it rings a bell that, like, you see a lot of these gambit type strategies where, like, a very good player is okay with sacrificing EV on an early street if he believes that it sets him up to complicate the game tree in his favor, if he believes that his opponent is going to try to counter it in an immature way, or even in an advanced initial way that then falls apart on future streets because his opponent just basically doesn't know how to operate from any sort of balanced notions as the hand proceeds. A lot of what happens is guys who try to exploit too wide out of position end up just hands over their head, getting caged on later streets by aggression from good players who are piling sort of as they should exploitatively. And especially if these players are risk averse who are trying to exploit out of position, it's like the worst combination to try to take an immature exploit and then to go into a passive orientation on a later street and then to get hit with aggression, meaning somebody's betting into you for a lot of money, and to have your mental game imbalances kick in and be like, I don't know what to do, I can't call with marginal hands, fold. And that's how you just start bleeding money. That's how we make a lot of money off of weak-minded players for the most part. Okay, we heard it here first from my 500 Zoom guy. 500 Zoom is still playing like shit, apparently. The best game in the world. That's the other thing, too, that's the massive assumption. I remember, like, coming up, this has always been true. Like, when I was doing training with Matthew Janda, the godfather of game theory, the thing that always used to come up was, like, Matt was very, very weary of me moving up stakes. He's like, bro, 200 NL on PokerStars is light years harder than 100 NL. And then when I finally moved up to 200 NL and I experienced it, I was like, no, it's not. This is like the same shit. I think it's sort of like that with every game that you move up into, maybe with the exception of going from like 510 to nosebleeds. Like 510 to 2550 might be like a really big improvement. But for the most part, it's just sort of like there's this stigma, this really ungrounded stigma that the games are much tougher every limit that you move up. And I would advise people to sort of learn that for themselves rather than hold a narrative in their mind that's really not serving you and probably, I mean, in my opinion, not even close to as true as people make it out to be. This question says, how do you deal with overthinking? I have an interest in psychology, philosophy, and personal development, and I'm finding myself consistently trying to fix problems in my head on a rational level. The problem is that the unconscious mind doesn't always agree with my rational solutions, and that leads to an inner conflict in me. Final sentence is, how does one find the right balance so that he can actually use rational thinking to his advantage instead of feeling that it may just do more harm than good? I actually wrote something on this down, so I want to make sure that I say it right. Okay. So first we need to define, like, what do you mean by rational? He's saying I'm a rational thinker, and sometimes there's an inner conflict because my subconscious mind doesn't believe the rational thought that I feel like is accurate. So what's happening here on like a structural level, to the best of my understanding, because I've done a lot of inward work, this is something that meditation is very useful for. Your rational mind is attempting to counter a subconscious belief. So what your rational mind believes is accurate. Let's use an example because it'll be easier. A lot of people, including myself, but less so lately, I would hope, struggle with feeling like they're going to lose control over reality. It's this control struggle where the rational mind is trying to assert control, but the subconscious mind deeply believes that it doesn't have control, that it lacks control. So what ends up happening is that your rational mind comes to the conclusion that it makes sense to try to get control over your reality. But because you don't subconsciously believe that, the rational thought actually only serves to reinforce what you don't believe at a deeper level. The deep-rooted belief is, I don't have control. The surface belief is, I'm going to get control, but it's a counter. Countering types of applications, countering actions, countering belief systems can only serve to actually intensify the core belief. So this is why I say most people are spinning wheels, and this applies almost everywhere with belief systems, where the thing that you're usually trying to force, in this case, control, is actually only serving to energize that you don't believe you have control. So it's like the fastest way to self-sabotage, more or less. Sorry, Facebook. Self-sabotage is basically you believing that you've made an adjustment that's going to give you higher accuracy, but the blind spot is that it's such a distorted viewpoint because it's being controlled by the subconscious, which doesn't actually believe it can get control and is desperately afraid of actually getting control. Like, that's the even weirder thing. It doesn't know what it would even do if it had control because it so deeply believes that it can't get it, and it doesn't want its paradigm challenged. It feels safe in a victim stance of not actually having control because it makes it feel special. That's one of them. Or it just doesn't want to stand out in some sort of way. People are very, very afraid of standing out in a negative way or in a way that sort of goes against the grain. So if you have these beliefs tied to the subconscious, then the rational mind will be like, no, I want control. It seems like I should be able to get control, but you can't actually get it because you don't believe you have it to begin with. We can go even deeper with this and say, what actually is control? Is it even a real thing? Can you actually get it if the mind that thinks that it wants control is usually countering a belief that doesn't know, that it knows that it doesn't have control? Would a person who believed they had full control even try to attempt to gain control? Isn't it redundant? Wouldn't it not even register in their consciousness to try to go and get control from reality if they truly believed they had inward control? So it plays on a really deep fundamental level, counterintuitive level, where we could probably make this statement. And this is something that I actually, I realized this when I was tripping on acid one time, which I highly recommend, even though most people would probably invalidate it. But it gets you face to face with how you're creating mirrors in front of your reality. And when I saw this thing, I was like, holy shit, this is next level. And I don't know where it came from, but I know it's on some sort of higher tip. And this was the thought. I should put this on my Instagram somewhere, because I posted it there. It says, the nature of control is counterintuitive. In order to get more control, you have to release control. So what is that saying exactly? It's saying, if you're still caught up or preoccupied with jockeying for control, you're actually only reinforcing that you don't have it. And all of your actions will dictate that, and you'll self-sabotage left and right. But if you actually fully give up the need for control, and I'm talking like full surrender, fuck it. And I've had a few of these breakthrough moments when I was doing high dosages of LSD, ketamine. Like, drugs were my thing for actually glimpsing this. And then I've had a few experiences just totally sober, usually in meditation, where like this has literally reformatted how I perceive reality in a lot of ways. That if I completely give up at the point of total fear of losing control, like irrational loss of control, like almost picture like you're going through a black hole, no idea where it's leading or how safe you are. This is the type of stuff that's sort of simulated in intense drug experiences. Picture that type of scenario, and then picture actually giving up the fight, as if there's no hope left. Can't escape it. The feeling of bliss and safety that suddenly develops when the mind completely relinquishes the need for control is like everything that you ever wanted from gaining control. Suddenly you're there, and there's no struggle for it. It's just present. It's present because you're no longer fighting for it, and you're no longer energizing the core belief that you can't get it or you don't have it. This is not something that the mind can logically understand, because if it could, most people wouldn't be doing what they're doing in terms of jockeying for control. It's one of those things that you can glimpse when you're dealing with counterintuitive logic, and you can see like there's some sort of truth to that. I can sense that there might be something valuable there, but until it's properly applied through experimentation and experience, you're not going to integrate it, and you won't trust it. So there won't be that relaxing of the mind into a more trusting place, where you actually have higher access to accuracy in your thoughts, because you're not so distorted and preoccupied with trying to gain safety. When working with this language optimizer, and one of the models that we use, I forget the name of it, but it's like this hierarchy of how human awareness develops. If you look over the course of many years of civilizations, what is a consistent trend is that like safety needs to be taken care of before the mind can develop to higher levels. And I think in a lot of ways, we have all these irrational fears about how safe we are, especially with like how social media is so intense with like our public image and shit. So much insecurity on showcase, and it creates these really, really irrational paranoias that make us feel like we're not safe. All these insecurities that develop that sort of block our consciousness from floating into these higher domains where it's a lighter energy field, you could say, if you want to speak in terms of that. Or you can just say that it's more logical. You take a lot of the baggage off of your mind, and then suddenly you're in this place of clarity. That's the way I experienced it, more or less. After I hit sort of my rock bottom period when I was 28, I went through a very rapid transformation in consciousness that isn't really quantifiable because it's so subjective. But if you went through it, you would know something shifted dramatically. a lightness, a clarity, a surrender in a way, where you didn't put so much focus on the things that used to preoccupy you and terrify you anymore. So that would be my first answer to that question is, if we can define what rational is, then we can see that the way the rational mind is trying to get what it wants is actually irrational from a higher line of sight or a higher paradigm, because the rational mind doesn't see that it's in a countering war with a deeper subconscious belief. So bring awareness to that before anything. I think that's the first chore, because it is tough. Like, you have to sit with this and you have to be really determined to see it, as opposed to defend the way that you used to think that it worked. The second part of his question was, how does one find the right balance between the rational and the subconscious? I'm thinking, so that he can actually use rational thinking to his advantage instead of feeling like it may just do him more harm than good. Okay, so this is what ends up happening. Once you have cleared the clouds, basically, of the cognitive distortion caused by paranoia and fear of failure, fear of losing control, and all of those major issues, once you clear a certain threshold with balancing those distortions, because that's what they really are, you will find yourself in a much more harmonized place mentally. And what you'll start to understand is, in this space, above the clouds, it's almost like there's only one of me now, where there used to be two of me, and it was like a war, this internal conflict. Now there's one of me, and it's like my vision unites, and it's a single-pointed focus now, instead of it being sort of like double vision, where they're working against each other, because I don't know which one to trust. Now it's like there's one of me. And once there's one of you, it gets a lot easier to trust yourself. Once this gets more aligned, it becomes much easier to trust what's going on inside of you. It becomes much easier to harness intuition, because there's not this voice in the head that's like, no, we can't trust that. That's not who we are. We're the rational mind. We're the logical mind. When the rational mind merges with the subconscious mind, and you see they never really were separate, there was just like this wound that developed that needed to be healed. Once that happens, you have sort of the hyper mind. Maslow's hierarchy, that's what it was. Thanks for the guy in the chat. That's what that model was. So Maslow's hierarchy basically would say that once the need of safety is taken care of and a certain amount of introspection is done to develop certain levels of awareness, the single pointed focus comes in, and higher accuracy can be accessed by the mind. And that's when you start to have really creative forms of expressions, I guess you could say, occurring in people. It was the point at which I started the company right after that, because I began to trust that I had this skill in methodology, and I was seeing things that I wasn't seeing before, and that nobody else in the community seemed to be seeing. And that was the time that I sort of walked away for a year, and I just sort of did my own thing. Just sort of dealt with myself and got on an independent learning path where I just trusted that I could harness this, whatever this was that was developing, this single pointed focus in my awareness. I could take feedback from my environment more humbly, and I could adjust without fear of failure in this regard. And then once I started to build that momentum, it only intensifies it, because I was getting good feedback from my environment. The mind was seeing, oh, we're getting results from this. So the rational mind began to trust more, and it just becomes much more easy to progress. And you just start to jump paradigms, and it goes higher and higher. And I don't know when it ends. I think with an earnestness about you and a humility, that you can take this really, really far. Like next level. Okay, that was the last question in the blog. I'm gonna talk about this thing that I promised I would leak. thought of this last night when I was playing. Sometimes it just takes being at the table to have like the better thoughts, or the thoughts that are just more relevant to like having guys understand the game at a high level, but not necessarily like a nuanced level or a micro level. Like this is probably the thing that I've come up with this year that I think that if you get it, you're gonna get it. Like you're gonna get the whole game through this thought. So it starts by expressing what is the difference between quality of regs. So let's take it in three parts. We've got the bad reg, the good reg, and the great reg. Sorry, Instagram, I had to check my notes there for a second. We're talking about what's the difference between the bad reg, the good reg, and the great reg. And if you can get this paradigm jump, you're going to get everything that you want in poker. The bad reg is the guy who he's playing a lot of really imbalanced early street strategies. So like picture the guy who attempts to balance a flop checking back range as the pre-flop raiser, but then ends up folding like 60-65% to stabs. Like he's got some really frequently occurring imbalance in a really detrimental place, because anything that occurs at a high frequency where he's heavily imbalanced can be exploited very regularly. So let's just work with that as like a standard for the bad reg. He's playing shitty pre-flop, like he might be even the guy who's like limping. That's more of like a fish thing, but that's like sort of the extreme, like a fish who limp calls, and is just playing a really imbalanced, low playability flopping range. Or the poor reg who checks back the flop in a really imbalanced way and then folds way too much to turn stab. Something that you can just exploit and pound on. That's the bad reg. He's also got just poor range versus range interaction understanding, and he'll make bad calls in a lot of spots where like a better reg would know to fold versus most players on a certain runoff. They're just not going to have enough bluffs, stuff like that. So it functions on small ball and large ball, but like for the most part, a lot of the bad reg is defined by like small ball early street strategy, and he just bleeds money. So the medium reg could be defined as a guy who plays closer to balanced strategies on early streets, is able to exploit the poor reg, but still lacks large pot range versus range interaction understanding, still has contradictions in his thought process around what balance actually is and when it's relevant. He struggles to calibrate for the most part. He's still somewhat playing his own autopilot game, and he's got a lot of inconsistencies around what the right way to jump around equilibrium is when he senses an imbalance. In a lot of ways, the medium reg still doesn't trust himself. And if he doesn't trust himself because he knows he doesn't have a solid understanding of theory or a fluency in equilibrium, that would be the more relevant way of putting it, he won't calibrate accurately when he detects imbalance, because he's almost not even scanning for imbalance anymore. And this is why GTO was so alluring to the mediocre reg community, is because they didn't trust themselves to play exploitatively, either because they didn't know how to detect it, or they didn't know what the proper counters were in terms of shifting around equilibrium. So they just chose basically what they thought was the easy way out or the safe way out, which actually just ends up being the rabbit-holing, impractical, inefficient way, because you can't play perfect. And GTO can't save you because you can't integrate it. So the medium reg still, in my opinion, has a lot of mental game leaks. He's got a lot of misunderstandings around how the game actually works, and it shows up in his inability to take lines that would be more accurate if he just trusted himself to detect what the imbalance actually is. So what is the great reg? The great reg is a guy who can crush the medium reg and still win at a really good clip off of a good reg, if the good reg is between the great and the medium reg. The great reg has a higher fluency in equilibrium. That's the best way I can put it. It's almost like the difference between being a native speaker in a language and someone who is just going there for immersion for a year or two. Like someone who could read a newspaper in another language and maybe get by pretty well out in public, as opposed to someone who could sit down with you at coffee and you would never know that this person wasn't raised in that country. That's the difference in understanding the fluency of a great reg, because equilibrium in itself becomes its own language. And this is why we're delving into restructuring the entire Poker Detox company, pretty much, as we're moving into larger staking contracts, and as there's more awareness being brought to our attention that the terminology that we're using, the methodology that we're using, could get better, could provide more care to guys of different learning types and guys of different native languages. It's becoming sort of the forefront of our attention to do what it takes to revamp the methodology that we already have, which I know to be world class. At this stage it is, but it's not worth anything if we can't communicate it efficiently to many different types of learners, types of native speaking languages. So it sort of parlays back over into efficient learning strategies as much as it parlays into how does a winner win at the table. A winner is a fluent speaker in equilibrium. In poker, we could say that's what it is. He knows what the right adjustment is if there's an imbalance in someone's range this way. He's also a meta thinker. He's very self-aware, so he knows psychologically how he's perceived at the table, and he's almost sort of bobbing and weaving in spots where other guys are forcing bets out of a theoretical notion that just, this is a spot where you bet, so I'm going to bet my bluff here, otherwise I'm not balanced. There's a lot of zones where if you pay attention to how you're being perceived, even right down to like the guy's timing tells in certain spots, you can duck a lot of these zones where he's on snap call, where you don't have to put the bluff in even though it's an optimal bluff, stuff like that. The great reg has better range versus range interaction understanding. He knows late street. He knows how to maneuver around more runoffs in a way that's objective and methodological and rooted in theory, somewhat quantifiable in the sense that like he knows when a card interacts much better with his opponent's range. He knows when it's going to be very hard for the guy to be over bluffing because almost all of his bluffs just completed. Like there's spots where that just happens. We call it code red. Where if I see a student bluff catching on a code red run out, that's marked as sort of like a metric violation. It's almost like that's his autopilot training kicking in. That should say, don't call when the board runs out 4 flush 4 straight and the guy's been betting an equity-driven bluffing range. He just doesn't have enough bluffs left. Don't bluff catch that board would be an example. That's a really basic example, but the reg is the great reg functions at a very high level of this, where if he's doing it right, he's got a very fluent methodology for how he approaches late street bluff catching. So his bluff catching pretty much is world class. His bluff catching efficiency. Someone asked in the Night Vision Skype group today, like they posted this hand where they're like, they had a marginal hand in the turn facing a turn barrel from a pre-flop raiser. They went check call flop, and they deal with like a medium pair where they face a barrel on the turn. Where if you look in a solver, that hand's like a mixed strategy. And the question is like, how do I approach this? And one of his reasonings was like, it's just very difficult when you know that you might face a river barrel to bluff catch this turn. I don't want to bluff catch in a spot where I could potentially face future aggression. That was the vibe of his post. And so I said, okay, to break this down relevantly, I would first start by doing a profile read on the person who's betting. What's his overall aggression frequency? If it's high, I'm going to lean towards calling these type of mixed strategy hands. If he's more of a nit, that's more of a practical fold for me. But more importantly, the mental game adjustment I gave him was that when I noticed that he's thinking about facing the river barrel, I made it clear to him that approximately 0% of my attention is focused on fearing facing a river bet. It's not even registering in my mind, but it's because I already know and trust that I have a methodology set up where I already know I'm going to respond accurately on whatever river falls. So I don't have to play this game with myself where it's like, oh God, I could call here, but if the river bet came in, I just don't know what I would do. No, I know what I'm doing because I work for it. I have a methodology for how I would approach almost every river in terms of how it interacts with his range, how it's going to function in terms of propensity or the likelihood that he overshoots his optimal bluffing frequency on that card if he's not very disciplined or very range aware himself. So for me, it's like when I see guys who are at a lower level deal with decisions, especially on later streets, I can see the inconsistencies in their thought patterns that are intensified by this paranoia where their subconscious knows they don't have a strong methodology for how to approach the next street. And that sends the rational mind into this frenzy of compensation where it tries to come up with all of these seemingly logical reasons why you might want to fold now, as opposed to call and face aggression on a later street. So it sort of ties back into what we said before, that like if you're not aware of how you're countering against insecurities, you're going to rationalize for things that aren't actually objective. And it's the difference between becoming a very, very strong thinker and strong player, and a player who has like great posture at the table, great internal posture. To be able to force a thought pattern out of the registry of your mind is a skill. And it's something that can be developed, and it requires great discipline. And in a way, it requires a lot of bravery, because if you think, why is that paranoia occurring? Like for those of you guys who get like increased heart rate, and sometimes I get this too, but it's almost like I don't believe it anymore. Like I don't believe that it needs to be given attention, even if it's occurring. But you get these guys that have these paranoid issues as the hand progresses, where they don't know how they're going to respond on the final street. And if you think about like what is actually going on there, like what are you afraid of? You're basically fighting against a core belief that you don't know what the fuck you're going to do if you face a threat. If you can train yourself to deregister that thought pattern and trust yourself enough, and this takes technical skill too, because you got to go and train this stuff so that you can integrate it. Otherwise, you don't have the right to trust. What are you going to trust? You haven't done the work. You have nothing to fall back on that's objective. So the rational mind, in a lot of ways, it's rational fear. It's protecting you. It's saying, hey man, maybe you need to go work on your shit a little bit more because you don't have a methodology for getting to this river. So you're kidding yourself if you think you're going to perform accurately. In a lot of ways, that's what happens when guys are like playing outside of their bankroll too. They're like, why do I feel this stress? I shouldn't feel bankroll stress. I shouldn't have to care about money. But like, it's the rational mind kicking in and being sort of like, we don't want to go broke, so drop limits before you fuck us. With this type of thing where you're afraid of getting to the river and facing aggression, it can be that on that level of like it's trying to protect you. And it can also just be the effect of trying to counter, the rational mind being like, no, subconscious, we're not listening to you. We got this. Trust me, we got this. When you're just fronting and you know that you don't have it. So at the point at which you actually put the work in, integrate it, develop a methodology that you can trust, the rational mind slowly begins to dissolve into the subconscious. And there's this healing that occurs where now you can actually force paranoid thought patterns out of the registry of your mind. And you become a really powerful thinker that way. And even if you're not immune to emotion at the table, at least there's a separation. At least you know where you're at, where you're deeply located. And it's not all tied up and twisted in these paranoid thought processes and tormented emotions that cause you to rationalize for things that aren't actually logical. Cool. I got that out decently. And I think it was more than... It was nice to tie it into the thing I said before about the rational thinking countering the subconscious, because I think it's sort of the theme of mental game in general. People are constantly afraid of taking their defense mechanism down when really it's the most purely incentivized thing. And it just keeps going up. Like, there's levels of releasing control. There's levels of releasing paranoia in game. So I would advise all of you, if you're serious, to get on a very hyper-accelerated path to the best of your ability with personal honesty in this department and my fronting on myself. I said this in the Elliot podcast today, where it's like, looking back on what did it for me in terms of like the success I had between 28 and 30 was pretty staggering. in terms of just like, it was almost like this slingshot effect where I pulled the rubber band back so far by banging my head against the wall for most of my 20s and reaching this really, really tough plateau. And then I released the rubber band, and there was so much velocity behind it because I had so much conviction that I couldn't go back to doing it that way. And I was tasting the freedom of doing it the new way. And it just sort of built this very, very intense momentum. And I think if you guys felt that, if you could just give yourself a week or 2 weeks to give a real chance to feel the momentum available in an independent learning path where you sort of release a lot of your defense mechanisms, you could scale very quickly. CFP applications are going to come out first week in December. We're currently revamping the site right now to be able to have the applications submitted through the site. A couple guys have already submitted. I'm going to have them resubmit. There's no points for showing up early in this one. But you can just basically go on the site. You'll submit a 2-minute video and a 2,500 word written format essay. I don't really like to call it that, but it's kind of what it is, where you just describe your career, your situation, let us know like what we need to know about you, and a couple other questions that will just give us a better idea as to sort of where you're at in your life. Poker Detox might be putting out a new public pack, maybe not. It's kind of in the works. It's not my pack, it's something that somebody made that I think is very high quality, and they're a former Night Vision student. It's a very metric-driven thing. I won't give any more details about it yet because it's still sort of like in the very beginning stages, but if we put that out, it'll be in January. I said I'm sort of not doing public packs anymore because I'm just almost solely focused on scaling the staking operation. But this thing might be something that doesn't require much of my attention because it's made by someone else, and we might sort of sponsor it. If you get selected for Coaching for Profits after the application process, which will be sort of like a month long, you will be basically put into circulation immediately in terms of into your training process. So the way that'll work is more or less, if you get accepted, we'll give you a call, say congrats. You'll get an invite to the Skype group where you'll meet your buddies, your new bros who are in your flight. I think we're probably going to take 4 to 6. And from that point, we will start distributing the content to you in a way that's very ordered. A lot of what we're doing right now is we're going through everything that we have, we're truncating it, meaning we're just basically like breaking it down and distilling it into the simplest, shortest, best version that we can make it. And then we're focusing on giving a lot of options for the learner on how to integrate key concepts. So say we have like 10 key concepts in the program. We want to have 3 or 4 different options for a learner to go in and integrate each concept. So it plays into catering and tailoring the course to different learning types. And we think it's going to have a really big impact. More info on the exact terms of the contract will be posted either on my blog or on the Detox website. The basic gist of it is we are only signing $500,000 contracts with guys who are dead serious. But there's a lot of benefits in terms of we're giving loans for life coaching. In fact, we require that you allow us to give you money, to loan you money to get a life coach. Loans for poker mind coach stuff like mental game sessions with Elliot Rowe, one of the best in the business at what he does. Very, very good at exposing inconsistencies in thought processes from the therapeutic level as opposed to like the micro poker aspect of it. Usually he'll take you back to something that occurred in childhood that has formed the distortion that you're under, and you can release it and heal it. I've had guys have just crazy results on even one session of going back and like experiencing something where they got yelled at as a child, and then suddenly that sort of cured their performance anxiety. I actually had an exact lesson like that where like some little league coach fucked me up when I was a kid, just sort of like screaming at us, taking all of his shit out on us, and it gave me this sort of performance anxiety that I suffered from for a while. And after doing that session with him, I noticed like a 75% increase in it. So stuff like that I think is just like super valuable. We front all the money for that because I just think it's worth it. You'll pay it off at the end of your contract or at some sort of incremental progression on your profit splits, not yet decided. Salaries are included. So if you got a family, or if you're just some dude who doesn't want to end up trying to vagabond it for a place to live, this is a good move for you. Salary, once you clear the equivalent of like 600 an hour larger as a winner, will be about 4,000 a month. So regardless if you have a losing month, you still get that 4,000 nut. So it's basically like having a real job, and then you get your profit splits on top of whatever your base salary is. So it's all the way nice for guys who are looking for greater stability and looking to take a training program serious with an industry that I think hasn't put enough care on the learner in this type of department, especially the other CFP options out there right now. Like, I don't want to flame, but I haven't heard of anything like this where there's so much catering being done to the student in terms of making him comfortable and giving him a proper support system, and all of the loans that we're giving to make sure that we have 7 different eyes on this guy's developmental process, and that he has accountability to 4 different people to show up and work on himself. Instagram's down, so I'll end it there. I'm going to be sort of traveling for the next 2 weeks. Maybe I'll try to get on Instagram, maybe Facebook too, and I'll just do like a dual video thing, and I'll take more questions. But I'm going to stick with this format, which I'm sort of calling like all things poker. And the blog on Rio will remain open for questions. So if you saw this and liked it and have a question that sort of sprung up from it, go check my blog out. It's in the journals section of Run It Once. It's called specifically Poker. I can actually just paste it into the chat right now. And you can post your question there, and I'll probably get to it.